Chapter 8 of Brain Twister. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Eastman, January 2009. Brain Twister by Mark Phillips. Chapter 8. 4 days later, he was more than tired. He was exhausted. The 6 psychopaths, including Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth I, had been housed in a converted dormitory in the Westinghouse area, together with 4 highly nervous and even more highly trained and investigated psychiatrists from St. Elizabeth's in Washington. The Convention of Nuts, as Malone called it privately, was in full swing. And it was every bit as strange as he'd thought it was going to be. Unfortunately, 5 of the 6, Her Majesty being the only exception, were completely out of contact with the world. The psychiatrists referred to them in worried tones as unavailable for therapy, and spent most of their time brooding over possible ways of bringing them back into the real world for a while, at least far enough so that they could be spoken with. Malone stayed away from the 5 who were completely psychotic. The weird babblings of 50-year-old Barry Miles disconcerted him. They sounded like little Charlie O'Neill's strange, semi-connected jabber, but Westinghouse's Dr. O'Connor said that it seemed to represent another phenomenon entirely. William Logan's blank face was a memory of horror. But the constant tinkling giggles of Ardith Parker, the studied and concentrated way that Gordon Macklin wove meaningless patterns in the air with his waving fingers, and the rhythmless, melodyless humming that seemed to be all there was to the personality of Robert Cassiday, were simply too much for Malone. Taken singly, each was frightening and remote. Altogether, they wove a picture of insanity that chilled him more than he wanted to admit. When the 7th telepath was flown in from Honolulu, Malone didn't even bother to see her. He let the psychiatrists take over directly, and simply avoided their sessions. Queen Elizabeth I, on the other hand, he found genuinely likable. According to the psych boys, she had been, as both Malone and Her Majesty had theorized, heavily frustrated by being the possessor of a talent which no one else recognized. Beyond that, the impact of other minds was disturbing. There was a slight loss of identity, which seemed to be a major factor in every case of telepathic insanity. But the Queen had compensated for her frustrations in the easiest possible way. She had simply traded her identity for another one, and had rationalized a single overruling delusion, that she was Queen Elizabeth I of England, still alive, and wrongfully deprived of her throne. "It's a beautiful rationalization," one of the psychiatrists said with more than a trace of admiration in his voice. "Complete and thoroughly consistent. She's just traded identities. And everything else she does, everything else, stems logically out of her delusional premise. Beautiful." She may have been crazy, Malone realized, but she was a long way from stupid. The project was in full swing. The only trouble was that they were no nearer finding the telepath than they had been 3 weeks before. With 5 completely blank human beings to work with, and the 6th, Queen Elizabeth, Malone heard privately that the last telepath, the girl from Honolulu, was no better than the first 5. She had apparently regressed into what one of the psychiatrists called a non-identity childhood syndrome. Malone didn't know what it meant, but it sounded terrible. With that crew, Malone could see why progress was their most difficult commodity. Dr. Harry Gamble, the head of Project Isle, was losing poundage by the hour with worry. And, Malone reflected, he could ill afford it. Burris, Malone, and Boyd had set themselves up in a temporary office within the Westinghouse area. The director had left his assistant in charge in Washington. Nothing, he said over and over again, was as important as the spy in Project Isle. Apparently, Boyd had come to believe that too. At any rate, though he was still truculent, there were no more outbursts of rebellion. But on the fourth day... "What do we do now?" Burris asked. "Shoot ourselves," Boyd said promptly. "Now, look here," Malone began, but he was overruled. "Boyd," Burris said levelly, "if I hear any more of that sort of pessimism, you're going to be an exception to the beard rule. One more crack out of you, and you can go out and buy yourself a razor." Boyd put his hand over his chin protectively and said nothing at all. "Wait a minute," Malone said. "Aren't there any sane telepaths in the world?" "We can't find any," Burris said. There was a knock at the office door. "Who's there?" Burris called. "Dr. Gamble," said the man's surprisingly baritone voice. Burris called, "Come in, Doctor." And the door opened. Dr. Gamble's lean face looked almost haggard. "Mr. Burris," he said, extending his arms a trifle, "can't anything be done?" Malone had seen Gamble speaking before, and had wondered if it would be possible for the man to talk with his hands tied behind his back. Apparently, it wouldn't be. "We feel that we are approaching a critical stage in Project Isle," the scientist said, enclosing one fist within the other hand. "If anything more gets out to the Soviets, we might as well publish our findings," a wide, outflung gesture of both arms, "in the newspapers." Burris stepped back. "We're doing the best we can, Dr. Gamble," he said. All things considered, his obvious try at radiating confidence was nearly successful. "After all," he went on, "we know a great deal more than we did 4 days ago. Miss Thompson has assured us that the spy is right here, within the compound of Yucca Flats Labs. We've bottled everything up in this compound, and I'm confident that no information is at present getting through to the Soviet government. Miss Thompson agrees with me." "Miss Thompson?" Gamble said, one hand at his bearded chin. "The Queen," Burris said. Gamble nodded, and 2 fingers touched his forehead. "Ah," he said. "Of course." He rubbed at the back of his neck. "But we can't keep everybody who's here now locked up forever. Sooner or later we'll have to let them..." His left hand described the gesture of a man tossing away a wad of paper. "Go." His hands fell to his sides. "We're lost unless we can find that spy." "We'll find him," Burris said, with a show of great confidence. "But..." "Give her time," Burris said. "Give her time. Remember her mental condition." Boyd looked up. "Rome," he said in an absent fashion, "wasn't built in a daze." Burris glared at him, but said nothing. Malone filled the conversational hole with what he thought would be nice and hopeful and untrue. "We know he's someone on the reservation, so we'll catch him eventually," he said. "And as long as his information isn't getting into Soviet hands, we're safe." He glanced at his wristwatch. Dr. Gamble said, "But..." My," Malone said. "Almost lunchtime. I have to go over and have lunch with Her Majesty. Maybe she's dug up something more." "I hope so," Dr. Gamble said, apparently successfully deflected. "I do hope so." "Well," Malone said, "pardon me." He shucked off his coat and trousers. Then he proceeded to put on the doublet and hose that hung in the little office closet. He shrugged into